You take something that's working, you change it very slightly, and you know that you're going to have something that works as well, but it may work better or it may work less so, in which case you always have a working product. So it's natural for corporates to favour incremental change, less risk. Because most corporates are risk adverse, the only solution to getting radical change is to use something that can introduce a step function, such as government, which can say, we want to do this project, we want to land somebody on the moon, we want to do something that hasn't been done before and cannot be done incrementally, and so they throw a bucket of money at it and they do the project. Now, corporates can do radical change. There are R&D departments that obviously hard at work trying to invent new things, but in general and increasingly, because of the increased remuneration to CEOs and the various structures of organisations, they're becoming much more short-term focused. They're looking at their return cycle to their investors on a 12-monthly, 2-yearly basis, which means that long-term R&D is suffering in the current corporate environment. So personally, I think the only way forward for the large-scale changes is either by dedicated organisations such as SENS Foundation that Aubrey de Grey set up, or government. Government sees a project, decides it's a good thing, has a more than 1-year plan, and implements it. Now, I cite, for example, the Chinese government have managed to do amazing things because they are able to make the decisions necessarily and are not beholden to incremental change.
How do we incentivize more energy and focus towards things like artificial general intelligence or Aubrey de Grey's SENS projects?
Well, the two projects are entirely diverse. I think, obviously, to how to incentivize a project that's aiming to make people live longer is to let people know about it. If people generally want to live longer, well, they certainly want to live healthier for longer. And as Aubrey de Grey is fond of pointing out, old age is not fun. So I think your question has to be split up into two cases. How do we incentivize AGI? And that opens up a myriad of problems. I mean, maybe we shouldn't be incentivizing AGI. Maybe we should be highly regulating it, because it's going to have such an enormous can of worms when it gets open that we don't know where it's going to lead us. It's something that we really need to discuss to a large number of people to be thinking about and to making comment on and making plans for it before we actually do it. Now, the reality is it's not going to happen. The people are just going to do it. They're going to go ahead, and it's going to be done in small groups, and Moore's law will probably take us across the threshold. They'll work out some algorithms that currently are incomputable. We will just get quantum computers or better computers, and it'll take us across the threshold, and before we know it, we will start to have call centres that are completely computerised rather than currently in India. So I don't think that one needs to be incentivised, other than to say that we really want people to discuss it. I agree with that. I think that is something that we need people to look at, and conferences such as your Singularity Summits are obviously the way to go. For the first that you mentioned, SENS, which is the tissue regeneration project, which is another paradigm in radically increasing human lifespan, I think that is already being done in the popular imagery by the advertising market, by people like Madonna. They're the champions of the living longer and healthier. I mean, you look at Madonna, she still looks drop-dead gorgeous. And I think, well, increasingly people say, look, if she can do it, I should be able to do it. The fact that she is able to do it because she's a multi-millionaire probably has got a lot to do with it, but the reality is that everyone will want that. So they will follow the leaders when it comes to that. Now, everyone has got a kind of politically correct way of speaking, saying, oh, it's good to grow old and die and be graceful, and old age is a good thing. But the reality is no one believes it. Individually, they all want to be healthier, they all want to be in their prime. All girls want to be Madonna, all boys want to be whoever in his prime, Arnold Schwarzenegger, whatever. And personally, I think so Hollywood and the advertisers, they're going to be the leaders in that. People want to look younger, but they also want to be younger. Beauty is not only skin deep, it's your ability to run and jump and get up in the morning and participate in lifestyle activities. People don't want to, I mean, they want to have a beach body, but they also want to go to the beach. So I think you're right that it's more than just cosmetics, and obviously regenerative medicine is more than just cosmetics. And at the moment, though, people don't see it as that. The industry is primarily being led by women, primarily simply because our society has placed such an enormous value on female fertility, youthfulness. There's no doubt that our society puts a high value on female youth. Every billboard you see effectively shows a young model in her early 20s or late teens. Now, they're not doing that because they are trying to be politically correct. They're doing it because they make money, and the reason they make money is because that's what people want to see. That's the perception of beauty. And if you look at many of the actresses from the 70s and 80s now, they still retain their youth via cosmetic surgery. In fact, they state that they have to do that. They've said it's a necessity in their industry. Now, they're not making it up. But I think to suggest that there's something wrong with our society that makes us think like that makes us value female attractiveness so much, is to deny the reality of the human condition, that at its core, genetically, we are animals, and genetically, that is what we like. That doesn't mean that we can't step back and say, oh no, we recognize that there is more to a person than just the genetic shell that they've been given. But we have to recognize that part of being human is sexuality, and we are designed to find a 19-year-old girl to be extremely attractive. So I think, getting back to your first question, the greatest driver of regenerative medicine is where those concepts start to become possible, where people start to see it in practice. And it's going to be the pop stars of the generation, the middle-aged but now looking incredibly attractive pop stars from the 70s. They're going to be the leaders in that revolution. They're the greatest billboards for ultimately regenerative medicine, because they will certainly be the ones that will take it up. And the interesting psychology of humans is that if you're good at something, because you concentrate on it, you become better at it. So a person who's naturally good at running practices being running, and thus they become extraordinarily good at it. They get far ahead of everyone else. And beauty is a similar thing. A young girl who's been praised for her good looks tends to concentrate on her good looks. Often wears more makeup than girls that aren't as pretty or haven't been praised, whether it be for sociological reasons or cultural reasons. But nonetheless, the consequence to that is that people who've grown up looking pretty want to stay pretty for longer. And because they've been rewarded for it, they often have more resources in order to do that. So again, I think that you'll start to see the regenerative medicine revolution headed up by the people who've gotten value from being attractive when they were young. they won't want to lose it. In the same way that you will see uptake of nootropic use amongst the elite. The smart people will start taking smart drugs because they see the value in being smart, so they want to make themselves smarter. So it's not that it's not something that's going to be led by people who don't have it. It's going to be led by people who do have it because they want more of it. And then everyone else will say, oh well, look, if they can have it, we should have it too. And that's where government has to step in and equalise it and make sure that this is something that we can distribute and be fair to everyone, so that everyone has fair access to these technologies.
Such enterprises that seem crazy in the public eye, how do we bring people over to funding something like the SENS project?
The problem with crazy ideas is there's a lot of them, and you can't fund them all. It's a simple reality. Some of the ones you mentioned, though, weren't crazy at the time. For example, the internet. That was really just an extension of the idea of local area networking, wasn't it? To take computers that were connected to each other, as they already had at that time, and then to make those connections larger, more diverse, and then develop a protocol, which was developed by the military, of course, to make that network automatically route the packets so that it wasn't vulnerable to network disruption, because you're always going to have network disruption in larger scale networks.
But it was crazy. I mean, the idea that that massive companies didn't really take to the internet until they were ready, until they could see, like, you know, an existence proof. They did, but it really wasn't a big thing. Like, it wasn't considered to be...
It wasn't something that private industry was interested in doing themselves, because of the question, as you asked before, about incremental change. That's why you have organisations like DARPA in the US. Their job is to look at projects which might be of immense significance, but are not going to be funded by industry simply because they are non-incremental. DARPA, that's their mandate. That's the sort of thing they do. The DSTO in Australia is a similar organisation, and obviously they're doing it because of defence. They don't want somebody coming up with some world-shaking discovery that puts the US or Australia or whatever country is funding it behind. So I think it's the idea of funding crazy ideas. Well, you've got to rank them on some kind of scale of craziness, of risk versus reward, and then you fund the ones at the top. It's that simple, based on what your scale is. Now, obviously, defence is a high priority. People don't want to be blown up. So consequently, crazy ideas that have defence implications are more likely to be funded than, say, a crazy idea that has a health implication. But that doesn't mean the health implication one's a bad one. It may even be a better one than the crazy idea that the military funded. But the simple fact is, there's no one out there except for governments that are able to do that kind of funding.
So governments, well, people seem to be motivated by fear or by profit more than they are by curiosity.
Well, yeah, I think if you look at Abraham Maslow, I think it was food, water, warmth, shelter, sex were the major motivators for people. And yep, I'd agree with that. That just goes back to our genetic substrate. People who weren't motivated by fear didn't have children. So we're all motivated by fear.
The idea is that it seems to be at the moment with governments and enterprise, it seems to be, okay, they're only interested in funding incremental change. What they can see in the next 1 year or 2 years will make a big difference. You know what I mean? It's not like they're funding things that will make a big difference 10 years out or 20 years out. They're interested in getting return on investment in a rather small amount of time, but not just, we're not just talking about time-wise, we're talking about idea-wise.
No, that's right.
You keep it moving.
No, look, Adam, you're quite right. But I think one of the problems that you have at a political level these days is that politicians aren't really interested in funding a project in 20 years' time. They're interested in doing what will get them re-elected in 3 years' time. So they have to do things for their constituents or for the public in a way that makes them look like they are on the ball, in touch, not necessarily for the long term. If you look at governments that can work for the long term, that aren't afraid of being elected, you either have most dictatorships, which are just abysmal because the dictator ends up with all the resources and money for themselves, or you end up with a government like China, which is obviously doing things beneficial to its population. The Chinese government have overseen the greatest expansion of wealth for the greatest number of people in the history of the world, and I think they've got to take credit for that, or be given credit from that. That the simple fact is that unless you, I'll backtrack. The problem is that our current democratic processes have become entirely solipsistic, that political leaders are no longer presenting what is good for the country, they are simply presenting what they think will get them re-elected. And that is the core to the problem. In Australia, Europe, the United States, and it's a real problem. One way out of it, educate people more. Hard to do, because even certain kinds of education are falling into disfavour, maths and science for instance. Yeah. So I don't see an easy solution to the problem. I agree with you, we obviously need more long-term funding, and there is some that does take place. The government doesn't do nothing. They obviously do sit down and do some regulations, and there are a lot of hard-working people in government departments that sit there, determine policy, but at a top level, the allocation of resources, no, we are disempowered by the current democratic processes and where they've gone.
So how do we then activate the democratic processes to work in the favour of something like SENS? Now, you must be aware that the reason for Aubrey de Grey's research isn't necessarily to come out with the ultimate answers on how to solve the regenerative medicine problems, but to provide existence proofs in mice or maybe even in humans, such that it'll incentivize and motivate people to take it seriously. And once people do take it seriously, then the government will take it seriously because they want to be re-elected.
Yeah, I agree, but the trouble with that is that by the time the government takes it seriously, it's often too late for meaningful discussion. The genie is out of the bottle. Same is going to be true of AGI. If we wait till the government takes it seriously and we already have it, it's too late. It's too late to have the meaningful discussion. It's too late. We can't put the genie back in the bottle, and God knows who will have it at that point. So I think it's important that we recognise that the root of the problem is systemic. Now, I'm not positing a solution here. I'm simply saying the first thing we have to do is recognise that those things that we think we hold dear, that is the capitalism, which is a great driver of innovation and wealth, no doubt, and democracy, which has served us extremely well for 100 years in this country. Both of those institutions are possibly now shackles. They may actually be holding us back, simply because politics has evolved to a form of solipsism and desire to be re-elected on the part of the politicians, and capitalists have now gotten so far ahead, are so powerful, that they are no longer in a level playing field. It's very hard to compete with a very large organisation, and what's worse is they're now feeding back into each other, that the capitalist system is advising the government as to regulatory policy, and that regulation of course favours those incumbent organisations within that system, and they are obviously doing it in a way that minimises competition to themselves. We know that money is a powerful factor in politics by looking at the US elections, where you can see that the last US election in 2008, they spent over $1 billion on the election cycle itself. Now, that money wouldn't be spent if it didn't do anything. The simple fact is the fact that money can affect people's opinions. Not the policies that the governments have, but the money being spent presenting those policies, presenting the politicians giving them time. And that is nothing to do with the merits of the argument of those people. It's simply educating the public as to what those people are saying, as to their personalities, as to what the people trying to get them elected themselves want. Now, those people who give that money, and a lot of that comes from corporate sponsors, are doing so because they perceive an advantage. The simple fact is that some of them support both sides. Wall Street are well known for giving money to both sides of the campaign, although they tend to give more to the Democrats, because they know that the Republicans will support them in any case, because they are the greatest beneficiaries to the system. So I think it's important to realize that the current system is broken. It's worked well, not denying it. There's no doubt that the system has merits, but is it applicable to our time? And I think you'll start to see the answer is no. That technology is now moving us into a realm where the institutions that have worked so well for us in the past may no longer be working well for us, and that we should be moving to a form of government more like China, where the government is able to make decisions, that everybody is considered to have a stake in it by right, by birth, and the system does its best to improve itself.
There is an idea that the near-term best approach of getting something like SENS active, or some technologies that we'd like to see in the short term being recognised and funded by large-scale organisations, is to do smaller scale experiments so as to provide existence proofs. Once the cat's out of the bag, that it looks as though, you know, a mouse or a dog or a cat has been rejuvenated from old age, like an equivalent to a 25-year-old in a mouse, then that will make a big difference.
To get corporate interest, you have to show that the corporation can make money, and they have to be able to secure intellectual property rights. Remember that if a large pharmaceutical company can't get intellectual property rights on a product, they are less likely to support it. The big pharma will copy other companies' drugs and put them on the market after the patents expire, but they won't actively pursue drugs generally that are not patentable, because it's just not worth putting them through the billion-dollar trial period in order to, you're not going to get the return. The regulatory costs are too high to get drugs like that into the market. I think, look, I agree with you, it's good to do small experiments, but that's not the be-all and end-all. Having done a small experiment, like take low-energy nuclear reaction, there's an enormous body of evidence now to suggest that there is something in low-energy nuclear reaction. But ever since Pons and Fleischmann and the debacle of the premature announcement that was made then, no one's interested, even though the evidence would now be vastly greater than it was back then, back in the 80s. There is no interest whatsoever from the major energy players, or no publicly declared interest. And therefore people doing that work are generally fairly strapped for funding, and in some cases they're castigated, they face a kind of academic, they tend to be excommunicated from the academic community. I tend to think those things are really happening, not in my area of course, but just looking at some of the solid evidence that's come out of Japan recently for low energy nuclear reactions, I think there's something there, but it's just very hard to get the major players interested, or certainly they're not going to be interested on the radar. They might look at them things privately to see if there's any money that they can be made out of them. I really think that though this is where government is meant to step up to the plate, as it used to do so well here with the CSIRO, that government, that's the job of government, is to say, hey, this is something that's interesting for us as a people, not necessarily you as a company, but it's certainly interesting for us as people. Remember that you're up against a problem that companies are in it for their own survival. A company has a vested interest in maintaining the problems that it has the solution for. So you're not going to get a company come up with a business concept that's going to wipe out that entire company with only a possibility of making a reasonable return from. They're going to have to be damn sure before they go into a new line of business. And that's just not going to happen. The reality is such that corporate culture is not going to happen. I think you need to have either private individuals who of course are led by a much more humane objective to achieve these things, or you're going to have to have a government that's strong enough to say, we want to do this because it's the right thing to do. We don't care if it goes against the interests of corporations in our country. We're going to do it. I mean, we can't even get a mining tax on in this country at this stage because of, for whatever reason. It's just, unfortunately, government has become disempowered of late. Certainly it's becoming increasingly disempowered in this country, and I'm sure it's true over most of the Western countries. Again, I'd be looking more at a system like China, which can make a decision in the best interest of the country, not necessarily in the interest of corporations within that country, and run with that decision. We are increasingly disempowered to doing that here.
We evolved as humans to be both local and linear. Our brains are designed to be tribal. Our brains imprints on one individual. When we see thousands of individuals, it doesn't make as bigger impact. So how can we motivate people to actually focus on getting regenerative medicine happening when all we're interested in is reading the tabloids?
I think the change will come about because people will start to see that it's possible. And I personally think they'll start to see it's possible because they'll see it done in individuals. They'll see various movie stars, etc., that appear to be ageless, and they'll say, oh, I want to look like her. I mean, this is already happening. That's why they use these people on billboards for cosmetic products, because people want to be like them. So increasingly, as people live their lives by proxy, using reality TV, using movies and other forms of escapism so that they don't have to face the various dangers but can gain some sort of visceral pleasure by watching other people experience them in a movie, I think you'll start to see, well, when people then look at those people in real life and say, oh, that person still looks pretty good for their age, I want to be like that too. How do they do it? And they'll pick up their Women's Day or their Men's or whatever the magazine is. They will see that this person is using some kind of stem cell rejuvenation treatment, and they'll be interested in it themselves. That's how this thing will start to kick off. The problem that you have is that you get a lot of pseudoscience in the area that in fact just recently I noticed that an Australian company was censored quite correctly by our TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Association, for misadvertising, where they advertised stem cell therapies when in fact there were no stem cells in any of their products or nothing related to it. And this, of course, is going to become prevalent because talk is cheap, and if talk sells things, then people are going to talk. So, look, there's no. I don't think there's any easy answer. That these, on one hand, you need to have serious science doing work like this, but serious science costs serious money, and unless you can get a large sum of money together or angel investors who will come in and say, yes, we think this is a good idea, such as Bill Gates is doing with malaria, saying, I think malaria, let's solve it, it's a good idea to solve it. So he's coming in and he put, I think it was about 500 million into fighting malaria. Now that's fantastic. It's a form of self-imposed taxation, where he gives back to the society that made him, certainly for a time, being the wealthiest man on earth. Now, that works, and that works well, because Bill Gates is an individual. He experiences a kind of human empathy to the problem. Companies don't see that. Companies don't have human empathy. They have their own DNA, which is making them react in a way that is sometimes less than humane. Thus you see all these quibbles about whether they can put AIDS medicine into Africa and how much it's going to cost, and whereas obviously it's a problem that needs to be solved. The drug companies argue, and possibly quite correctly, that they can't afford to fund the research necessary to develop these things and then give them away for free. And that they say, well, this is just not how the capitalist system works. These things have to be costed. Well, I think this just highlights the need for governance. This is where the government has to step in, that we have to have organisations like the CSIRO and the now privatised Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. And these organisations have to be out there doing those things that private companies will not do. And they do them for the benefit of the Commonwealth, for everybody, for all of us. Or else we have to rely on rich private angel investors.
Okay. Often, to get anywhere, we need to constrain the problem. We need to constrain the boundaries of the problem that we are trying to solve. Okay, but often we come to a situation where we find out something and the boundaries change. The boundaries to the problems change, or we have a preconceived idea of what the actual problem is before we do a whole heap of experiments and actually really find out what the problem is. So how do we go about stretching the constraints that we've already imposed on certain problems and our approach to solving them?
Well, this goes back to the old conflict in AI. We originally, it's whether we use bricks or whether we just build the wall. Now, the early philosophy was to say, all right, let's build bricks, and each brick will be some highly constrained, understood process, and because we're using Turing machines, we can build these bricks and we can solve any problem given. And of course, it turned out that we couldn't define the problems. We knew that we could solve them because we as people were solving them, but we didn't know how to solve them. So I think what you're describing is, when you say redefinition of boundaries, is just a simple discovery that the problem, whilst that we could understand the answer, we couldn't really understand the question. We didn't understand certainly how we got from that question to the answer that we were able to deliver, because we weren't able to understand us, because the more we looked at our processes, the more we looked at the process going on in the brain, the more complex we found it to be. That simple answers just don't work for real world problems. The real world is complicated, reactive, reflexive, and therefore the solutions have to be complicated. We as humans, of course, are always looking for pithy, simple solutions. But unfortunately, in reality, in many cases, there are no pithy, simple solutions. The reality is complex, and thus we have to develop equally complex systems to come up with answers to those. And even those answers themselves are not solutions, they are approximations to a solution. They are things that work. Now, the greatest paradigm shift in AI has been the acceptance that we can now develop systems that can solve problems, and we don't know how they do it. We know how they derive the solution. We know how they learn, but we cannot predict what solution they will come up with until they've done it. In other words, they are starting to act more like us. Alright, so in summary, how do we bound the problems that we face in the real world? Well, speaking from a field roboticist, which I am more than an academic AI designer, we work much more on an evolutionary principle. We basically take something that works, change it, apply technologies that may have been used in other industries, which is how we get our greatest paradigm shifts. We bring in technologies that have been developed elsewhere and apply them to the problems that we have in the mining environment. So the answer to what you've asked is we basically don't bound the problems. We simply engineer a solution. We see if it works, and if it doesn't, because we suddenly discover that there's a new dimension to the problem that we hadn't thought of, then we tack on something to tackle that. And so it goes on. If we had more intelligent systems, AGI systems, or bigger teams of people working on the problem, then sure, it may be possible to simulate and anticipate all these complexities before they appear. But the real world's not like that. The real world, we build something. Once we get it working, we then try and generalize it, simplify it, tack things on, re-engineer, de-engineer. You just solve the problem. And then you sit down and say, okay, after you've got a solution, you then analyze how it works and try and minimize it, mainly for cost reasons, to make it simpler, to make it, because the simpler you can make it, the more reliable it comes generally. So the answer is, in modern systems we don't really try and bound them. We simply say, this is our problem domain. You obviously try and define the problem domain as much as you can, but the reality is that you can't. I think a lot of this discussion centers on the importance of simulation. We don't have the time in the real world to run real world experiments. It's too expensive and too time consuming. In the mining industry, because there are so many things going on in, say, an underground mine or even an open cut, and production is such a high priority, any developmental systems obviously take the back seat to production in general. Certainly at a time like this where prices are high, and so there's enormous pressure to produce. And the consequence is that trying to develop things in an operational environment is very difficult. And your simulated environments, of course, are not nearly as complex as your actual operational production environments. So a lot of work we do is to try and develop those simulations, to understand the processes and mechanisms that we are trying to deploy into, simulating those processes and mechanisms, and then developing the systems on the simulations, because then you can actually do the development in real time. So I think you'll find that my industry is not unique in that respect, and that medicine is something where simulation is going to play a huge part in the future. So we're going to see increasing examples of virtualization of processes, whether it be industrial processes, whether it be sociological processes, or even whole societies a la Second Life. That this development of increasingly higher fidelity simulations is probably one of the most significant technological innovations that have been taking place in the last 20 years. Essentially, in the past we've done simulations, but we've generally just called them models. They've been, we develop a kind of mathematical model, and of course this started back in economics originally. Malthus and his forecasting were of course extremely simple models of society. But now, primarily because of Moore's law, our models are no longer simple, and that they, in some problem domains, have completely subsumed the domain. We can model Newtonian physics very well now. We're not so good at quantum mechanics, and we're not so good at very complex multi-body problems. But we've got the basic model down pat, and so if we constrain the size of the problem, we can have a fairly good go at simulating it, and thus we have no problem now developing algorithms that can send satellites in orbit around the Earth, and we can get them in orbit around Mars and don't usually crash into the thing. But this trend of using models rather than reality to do development is going to continue and expand. Is this the region, this the soil, this the clime that we have changed for heaven? This mournful gloom for that celestial light? Then be it so, for he who now is sovereign can dispose and bid that which is right. And farthest from him is best, for he who reason hath equalled, force alone hath made supreme above his equals.